The fluorescent lights of Metropolitan General Hospital hummed their endless mechanical song. Dr. Leila Okonkwo stood at the sink in the surgical lounge washing her hands with deliberate care. Her movements were precise, even as exhaustion pulled at the edges of her consciousness. The water ran warm over her knuckles, carrying away the microscopic evidence of the last 16 hours. 16 hours. That is how long she had been holding the life of an 8-year-old girl in her hands, literally. The child, Emma Whitfield, had fallen from playground equipment 3 days ago. Traumatic brain injury, subdural hematoma. The kind of case that walks in the door and transforms from an ordinary Tuesday into something that will either end in recovery or devastation. Emma's parents had been in the waiting room that morning. Their faces carried the particular kind of terror that only comes when your child is about to have someone drill through their skull. The surgery had taken every ounce of Leila's expertise. The brain swelling was more severe than the initial scans suggested. The blood clot was positioned in a location that made every decision feel like threading a needle while blindfolded. But Leila had done this procedure more than 300 times. Her hands knew the anatomy. Her mind knew the physics. And somehow, through 16 hours of concentration, so intense it felt like she was operating in a trance state she had guided that little girl through. Emma had woken up in recovery. Her parents had cried. The nurses had documented another success in the long list of successes that defined Leila's career. Now her scrubs were wrinkled and stained. Blood, or was it saline solution, had dried on the cuff of her right sleeve in a dark brown streak. Her dark eyes, usually sharp and alert, felt glazed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from being awake for a day and a half straight. She looked in the mirror above the sink and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Not Dr. Leila Okonkwo, chief of neurosurgery. Just a black woman who happened to be standing in a hospital lounge trying to remember if she had eaten anything in the last 8 hours. The break room clock showed 5:47 p.m. She had another shift starting in 12 hours. Protocol said she should sleep. Her body was screaming for sleep. But first, she had to get home. She had to cross the city that was now darkening into early evening. She had to exist in the world for that span of time before she could collapse into bed. Leila dried her hands on a paper towel and headed toward the exit. The hospital parking garage was cool and dim. Her silver Mercedes sat exactly where she had left it 33 hours ago, before she came in for the pre-operative assessments. She clicked the key fob. The car's lights blinked to life. She settled into the driver's seat. And for just a moment, she allowed herself to sit in the darkness without moving. She thought about Emma. The girl would recover. The surgery had worked. The neural pathways would reorganize themselves around the trauma. Children were resilient in ways that adults were not. In 6 months, Emma would be playing on playgrounds again. In a year, this would be a scar on her scalp and a story her parents would tell with gratitude. And Leila would move on to the next emergency, the next terrified family, the next set of 16-hour shifts. This was her life. This was what she had chosen when she spent 12 years becoming a surgeon, then 7 more becoming a specialist in pediatric brain trauma. She started the engine and pulled out of the garage into the approaching evening. 3 miles away, Officer James Whitfield sat in his patrol car in the parking lot of a convenience store. He gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. His short-sleeved uniform stretched across his chest as his shoulders tensed and released. Tensed and released. A physical manifestation of anger that had been building in him for 7 years. The radio crackled. Dispatch was calling for units on the north side. He did not respond. Instead, he sat in his car and thought about the things that had made him angry that day. His captain's comment about his statistics. His wife's suggestion that maybe he should try to understand different perspectives. The new neighborhood they had moved into with its carefully manicured lawns. Its subtle way of making him feel like he was not quite rich enough, not quite educated enough, not quite something enough to belong there. People looked at his uniform and made assumptions about what it meant. They thought it meant he was a protector. They thought it meant he was constrained by rules and regulations. They did not understand that the uniform was actually a liberation. The uniform was permission. It was the thing that allowed him to do what he actually wanted to do, which was to assert his authority over people who would not respect him otherwise. He had always been this way. In high school, he had loved the idea of becoming a cop because his guidance counselor had suggested he did not have the grades for much else. In his 20s, he had quickly discovered that he was not particularly good at the nuances of the job, the investigation, the problem-solving, the communication skills that the better officers seemed to have. But he was good at one thing. He was good at intimidating people. He was good at making people afraid of him. And that felt like power. Over the years, he had learned how to exploit every gap in the system. He had learned which supervisors would not ask too many questions. He had learned how to write reports that twisted reality just enough to sound plausible. He had learned which neighborhoods had residents who were less likely to fight back, less likely to hire lawyers, less likely to make an official complaint that would actually stick. And he had built a small empire of fear in those neighborhoods. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would get him fired, just traffic stops that did not need to happen, searches that were not quite justified, intimidation that was just barely within the line of plausible authority. Now he was 34 years old, and it was finally starting to catch up with him. The new police chief, Caldwell Byron, some kind of idealistic reformer, had started asking questions about his stop statistics. There were whispers at the station. People were watching him differently, and that made him angry in a way that was hard to articulate. Because he had never actually thought of what he was doing as wrong. It was just the job. It was just how things worked. He started the engine of his patrol car and began driving with no particular destination in mind. Dr. Leila Okonkwo drove through the neighborhood where she lived, a place called Oak Ridge, a suburb of tasteful homes and quiet streets, the kind of place where people were supposed to feel safe. She had moved here 3 years ago, after her career had finally reached the point where she could afford something more than a small apartment. The neighborhood was majority white and majority wealthy, and she had been aware when she moved in that she was doing something that required a certain amount of courage. Not because anyone was explicitly unwelcoming, but because of the small moments, the glances, the way conversations sometimes paused when she entered a room, the barely perceptible surprise when people learned that she owned her house, that she had bought it with money she had earned, that she belonged there as surely as anyone else on the street. But she belonged. She had worked too hard not to belong. The traffic light at 4th and Elm turned yellow just as she approached. She slowed, gliding to a gentle stop. The pedestrian crossing light showed white. A mother pushing a stroller waited at the corner. The street was peaceful. The evening was calm. Leila was thinking about sleep. She was thinking about the memory foam mattress in her bedroom, about the 8 uninterrupted hours she might, if she was lucky, actually get before her alarm went off. She was thinking about coffee, and about whether she should stop somewhere to get food, because she knew that showing up at home and then trying to sleep on an empty stomach would just lead to restless dreams. The light turned green. She moved forward into the intersection. A patrol car turned the corner ahead of her. Even though Leila had never seen this particular car before, something in her nervous system registered the presence of the uniform. It was the kind of recognition that lived below consciousness, a learned response to a symbol of authority. The way a wild animal might suddenly become aware of a predator entering its territory. She saw the car. The car saw her. And in that moment, Officer James Whitfield made a decision that would alter both of their lives, in ways that neither of them could yet imagine. The operating room of Metropolitan General was a space where Dr. Leila Okonkwo felt most at home in the world. Paradoxically, it was one of the most dangerous rooms in any hospital, filled with the possibility of catastrophic failure, with the weight of human mortality sitting just beneath the surface of every decision. But it was also a room where the rules made sense, It was a room where her expertise was undeniable. It was a room where her race, her gender, her background, her everything did not matter. Only her hands, only her knowledge, only her ability to navigate the geography of a human brain and coax it back to normal function. 16 hours earlier at 1:15 a.m., the ER had brought Emma Whitfield to the operating room on a stretcher. The 8-year-old girl had been admitted with a Glasgow Coma Scale score of 9, which meant she was in a deep unconscious state. The CT scan showed the damage. Traumatic brain injury with subdural hematoma, meaning blood was pooling beneath the tissue that wrapped the brain. The pressure was mounting. The brain was being compressed. And in the window of time before irreversible damage occurred, the only solution was surgery. Leila had reviewed the images a dozen times. She had consulted with the neuroradiology team. She had spoken to the girl's parents in that terrible waiting room where they stood with the kind of terror in their eyes that no parent should ever have to feel. The surgery is our best chance. The hematoma needs to be evacuated. We will perform a craniotomy, which means we will create an opening in the skull to access the blood clot and remove it. The brain swelling is significant, so we will need to manage that carefully. The surgery could take anywhere from 12 to 18 hours. During that time, there is risk. Anesthesia risks. Bleeding risks. The risk that the brain has been damaged in ways we cannot fully see on the scan. But without surgery, the swelling will continue, and the outcome will be catastrophic. She had said it all calmly, the way she had said it to dozens of families before. She had said it with the absolute confidence that comes from knowing she had done this procedure successfully more than 300 times. And she had said it while something in her heart was breaking for this little girl, for her parents, for the randomness of the moment that had placed Emma on a playground and gravity in motion. At 2:47 a.m., with Emma's scalp prepped and the monitors running and the surgical team in place, Leila had made the first incision. The surgery had been complex. The hematoma was larger than the scan had suggested, which meant more extensive excavation was necessary. The brain swelling was more severe, which meant more careful manipulation of surrounding tissue. There had been moments where Leila had to make split-second decisions, based on visual information that contradicted her original assessment. There had been moments where she had to call for different instruments, where she had to slow everything down and breathe and remember that underneath her hands was a child's future. But she had done it. At 6:33 p.m. that evening, after 16 hours in the operating room with only brief breaks for water and energy gels, Leila had successfully removed the hematoma, drained the subdural space, and begun the process of closing. The brain tissue looked healthy. The bleeding had been controlled. The swelling, while still present, was manageable. The monitors showed stable vitals. The girl's brain activity was responding to stimulus. In the recovery room, Emma's eyes had flickered open. Leila had stood there for a moment watching the child's parents rush to her side, watching them cry with relief, watching the terrible weight of fear lift from their faces and be replaced with something like gratitude. She had been present for more than 300 of these moments, and it never got old. This was why she had spent 15 years becoming a surgeon. This was why she had endured the dismissals and the condescension, the assumptions that she was not quite as capable as her white male colleagues. This moment right here was worth all of it. By 5:47 p.m., Leila was cleaned up and dressed in her street clothes, a casual sweater and jeans, the uniform of someone who was done with the intensity of the hospital day. She walked through the parking garage toward her silver Mercedes, a car she had bought 3 years ago as a celebration of making it to this level of success. The car was beautiful. It was a symbol of her achievement. It was also, she would later realize, a liability. The drive home took about 20 minutes. She could have taken the highway, but she preferred the surface streets that ran through the neighborhoods. It was slower, but it felt less aggressive. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The radio was playing soft jazz. Leila was so tired that her body felt like it was made of lead. But the exhaustion had crossed a threshold into something almost euphoric. She had saved a life today. She had done something that mattered. She did not notice the patrol car until the lights came on behind her. Officer James Whitfield had been driving with no particular destination when he spotted the silver Mercedes on 4th Avenue. His attention caught on the contrast. An expensive car, a nice neighborhood, a driver whose skin was visible through the window even at 50 yards away. His brain made the connection in less than a second. This did not match. This woman did not belong in this car, in this neighborhood at this time of evening. He knew it was the kind of decision that the new chief might question. He knew it was the kind of stop that, if examined too closely, would not hold up to scrutiny. But he also knew that the scrutiny was never going to come if he played it right. He knew how to write a report that would make the stop sound legitimate. He knew how to make it sound like there was a traffic violation, or suspicious behavior, or something that justified the interaction. He activated his lights. Leila heard the siren, and her heart immediately began racing. She had done nothing wrong. She knew she had done nothing wrong. But there was still that particular fear that came with being a black woman in America, with having the visible presence of authority behind you, with knowing that the rules of engagement were not necessarily written in your favor. She signaled. She pulled over slowly and deliberately. She turned off the engine. She placed both of her hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible, and she waited. Officer Whitfield approached the car with his hand resting on his utility belt. His expression already twisted into something like contempt. He leaned down to look through the window. His sneer deepened when he saw her scrubs, the blue surgical scrubs that she was still wearing underneath her sweater, the evidence of the place she had just come from. License and registration. He said it without preamble. Leila's hands were trembling slightly as she reached for the glove compartment. As she pulled out the documents that proved she was the registered owner of this vehicle. She was a neurosurgeon. She had a house. She had paid taxes. She had earned every single thing about her life through competence and hard work. But she also knew that none of that would matter if this officer had already decided something different. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Whitfield asked. He was still leaning down, still looking at her with an expression that suggested he had caught her doing something deeply wrong. "No, sir," Leila said. Her voice was steady. She had learned how to make her voice steady in the presence of people with the power to hurt her. "I was doing the speed limit. I have proper documentation." Whitfield straightened up slightly. His expression shifted into something darker. "Your vehicle matches a description in a theft report. Silver Mercedes license plate ending in 473. Leila felt her stomach drop. "No, sir. This is my vehicle. I just purchased it 3 years ago. I have the title, the registration, everything." But even as she said it, she could see in his face that it did not matter. He had already decided what he believed, and her evidence would only be experienced as resistance. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Officer Whitfield said. His voice took on that particular quality that meant he was preparing to escalate. Leila could hear it in his tone. The brittleness, the thing that suggested he was looking for a reason to move this interaction from simple stop to something more confrontational. She reached for the door handle slowly, her movements deliberate and careful. The last thing she needed was for him to interpret any sudden movement as threatening. She had seen videos. She had read the stories. She knew what could happen in these moments when a black woman's actions were interpreted through a lens of suspicion and fear. The evening air was cool against her face as she stepped out of the car. Her hands were still visible. Her posture was open. She was doing everything the training videos suggested. The ones that circulated through the hospital. The ones that talked about how to survive encounters with police. "I am a neurosurgeon at Metropolitan General," she said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "I just completed an emergency surgery. I am wearing my scrubs under my sweater because I came straight from the hospital. I understand your concern about the vehicle, but I assure you that I am the registered owner." She spoke with the quiet authority of someone used to being in charge, used to managing difficult situations, used to being heard. She was used to walking into trauma centers and making decisions that affected life and death. She was used to being respected. But those things, her education, her expertise, her accomplishment, seemed to be having the opposite effect on Officer Whitfield. His face flushed red. "Did you think I would fall for this just because you are wearing a costume?" he said. "I do not care what you claim to do. A vehicle like this, driven by someone like you in a neighborhood like this, it does not add up." Leila felt something crystallize inside her. She understood in that moment that this was not about the vehicle. This was not about a theft report. This was about his perception of what a black woman should be able to afford, about his assumptions regarding her background, about his comfort level with seeing someone who looked like her in a position of success. "I understand this appears unusual," she said. And now her voice carried a thread of something steel-like beneath the professional courtesy. "But I can verify everything I am saying. I have my hospital identification. I have my medical license. I have the title to this vehicle. My home is 3 blocks away. If you would allow me to show you my credentials, I can clear this up very quickly." She reached toward the hanging strap of her identification badge, which was still around her neck, still hanging from the hospital parking pass. She moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to give him any excuse to interpret her actions as threatening. "Do not touch anything," Whitfield snapped. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Leila stopped, her hand frozen halfway to her badge. She looked at him, and something in her expression must have communicated the recognition of the trap she was in, because his expression darkened even further. The street was becoming active now. Lights were coming on in houses. People were emerging onto their porches, drawn by the unusual activity. By the sight of a patrol car stopped in front of one of the houses on their quiet suburban street. Neighbors were watching. Someone Leila was certain was recording on a phone. "You know what I think," Whitfield said. His voice had taken on a conversational quality, which somehow made it more threatening. "I think you are not telling me the truth. I think there is something you are not saying. I think maybe you are mixed up with some kind of criminal activity, and you are trying to use the clothes you are wearing and the story you are telling to make me believe you are something you are not." "I am not mixed up in anything," Leila said. She could hear her own voice beginning to show cracks in the composure she had been maintaining. 16 hours of surgery, the need for sleep. And now this confrontation with someone who had already decided who she was and what she represented, regardless of what she actually was. "My license registration and medical credentials are in my vehicle. I am happy to show them to you. I can call the hospital. I can call my department chair. I can show you the surgery I performed this morning. I did a craniotomy on an 8-year-old girl with traumatic brain injury. The procedure was successful. I just spent 16 hours saving a child's life. And now I am trying to go home to get some sleep before my next shift." The words came out faster than she intended, the exhaustion finally starting to crack through her professional facade. And watching Whitfield's expression as she spoke, Leila realized with a sinking sense of helplessness that none of it mattered. The more evidence she provided, the more her expertise, the more of her actual truth she offered, the more he seemed to become convinced that she was lying. "Medical terminology," Whitfield said with a harsh laugh. "You have done your homework, I will give you that. But it does not change what I am seeing here. A car like this, you, this neighborhood, none of it adds up." Leila felt her hands begin to tremble again, but this time it was not from fear, it was from anger. It was from the terrible, helpless awareness that she was navigating a situation where every move she made was being interpreted through a lens of suspicion, where her credentials did not matter, where her truth was being processed as lies, where the fundamental fairness of the situation had already been removed. "Officer Whitfield," she said, reading his name badge for the first time. "I do not know what else I can do to help you verify my story, but I am telling you the truth. I am a neurosurgeon. I did perform that surgery. This is my car. I live 3 blocks away, and I would like to go home." He stepped closer to her, his body language becoming more aggressive. His hand, she noticed, had moved to rest on his utility belt, close to the taser that hung there. "What you are going to do," he said, each word coming out separately as if he was speaking to someone who did not understand English, "is stop telling me stories and start cooperating." Around them, the neighborhood had gone very quiet. The neighbors watching from their porches had seen what was happening. The violence of the situation was not physical yet, but it was there in the air, the potential for it, the knowledge that this interaction could escalate in a direction that would leave Leila hurt, arrested, or worse. Leila made a decision in that moment that would ripple through the next several months. She could have backed down. She could have accepted his framing, agreed that her own evidence was somehow false, apologized for existing in a way that he found confusing or threatening. She could have made the situation easier for him by accepting his narrative about who she was. Instead, she did something different. She stood up straighter. She looked directly into his eyes, and she refused the lie. "I understand that you are confused," she said, and there was something in her voice now, something that came from 15 years of being doubted by people who were less qualified than she was, something that came from countless moments of having to assert her expertise in rooms full of men who assumed she did not belong there. "But I am not confused about who I am. I am Dr. Leila Okonkwo. I am the chief of neurosurgery at Metropolitan General Hospital. This is my Mercedes. I earned this car through my work. I earned my position through my expertise. And I am telling you the truth about all of it." She said it clearly. She said it with certainty. And she said it in a way that made it clear that she was not going to accept his version of reality. For just a moment, Whitfield looked almost shocked that she would push back against him. It was clear that he was not used to being contradicted, particularly not by a woman, and particularly not by a black woman. But the shock only lasted a moment before his face reddened with a different kind of anger. "You think you are smart," he said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. "You think that talking fancy and using big words is going to make me believe some made-up story. But I have been a police officer for 12 years. I know what the truth looks like, and this is not it." He reached toward his utility belt. His hand moved toward the taser. In the moment that Officer Whitfield's hand closed around the taser, Leila's entire nervous system shifted into a different state. The exhaustion that had been weighing on her moments before evaporated, replaced by a flood of adrenaline that made everything suddenly sharp and clear. This was no longer about a traffic stop. This was no longer about a misunderstanding that could be resolved through conversation or evidence or explanation. This was about a man with power deciding that he was going to use that power against her. Leila had read the studies. She had seen the statistics. She had looked at the videos that circulated on social media of traffic stops that had gone wrong. She understood in an intellectual way that this could end badly. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it in real time were two very different things. "Officer Whitfield," she said, and she was proud that her voice remained steady, even as her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I am not a threat. I have not resisted any of your orders. I have complied with everything you have asked me to do." The witnesses on the porches had their phones out now. Multiple people were recording. The street had gone from peaceful to tense, from normal to something that felt like it was approaching the edge of violence. "Get your hands where I can see them," Whitfield commanded. "Now." Leila raised her hands slowly, showing her palms, showing that she was not a threat. but she could see that nothing she did would change his calculation. He had made a decision, and she was going to have to live with the consequences of that decision, regardless of her actual threat level, regardless of what she had done or not done. The taser came free from his belt. It was a small device, barely larger than a gun, but it looked impossibly large in that moment. Leila understood what it did. She understood the electricity, the loss of muscle control, the vulnerability of being incapacitated in front of neighbors, in front of cameras, in front of all of the evidence that would later be used to reconstruct what happened here. "Please," she said, and it cost her something to say that word, something that felt like dignity. "I am not a threat. I am a surgeon coming home from work. That is all this is." But Officer Whitfield had already made his decision. Maybe it was the refusal to accept his framing. Maybe it was the fact that she had pushed back. Maybe it was something in his psychology that had decided that this moment needed to end with him reasserting his authority in the most dramatic way possible. He raised the taser, and then he pulled the trigger. The electricity came first. It was not pain, exactly, though there was pain. It was more like her entire body ceased to be under her control. Every muscle contracted simultaneously, and she fell backward onto the asphalt with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. The concrete scraped her skin. The taser barbs had stuck into her shoulder and her lower back, delivering the electrical current that made her body into something that was no longer hers. And there was the sound. She heard herself make a sound she had never made before, something between a gasp and a scream. There was humiliation in that sound. There was violation. There was the terrible knowledge that her own body was betraying her, that the fine motor control she had spent a lifetime developing was being overridden by this device and this man and this situation. The electrical current lasted for 5 seconds. It felt like 5 minutes. When it stopped, Leila lay on the pavement, gasping for breath, her muscles still twitching with aftershocks. The neighbors were still recording. She could hear them. She could hear someone shouting. She could hear Officer Whitfield's voice, but she could not make out what he was saying. And then there was the sound of her neighbors, the quiet suburban people who had bought their houses in this neighborhood to be safe, to be away from the chaos of the city. Now watching a black woman being tased by a police officer, now documenting the moment when safety had become something provisional. "She is a doctor," someone was shouting. A woman's voice, probably from across the street. "That is Dr. Okonkwo. She lives over there. She is a doctor." But Officer Whitfield was not listening to the neighbors. He was already reaching for the handcuffs that hung from his belt. He was already moving to restrain her, to take control of the situation, to ensure that his narrative would be the one that stuck. The handcuffs went on tight enough to cut off circulation. Leila's hands, the hands that had navigated a child's brain tissue with millimeter precision just hours before, were now being forced behind her back in a way that felt brutal and permanent. Officer Whitfield was not gentle about it. He was making a point. He was demonstrating the cost of pushing back against his authority. "Dr. Leila Okonkwo," he said, his voice taking on the formalized tone of someone making an arrest. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting a police officer." The words did not make sense. She had not obstructed anything. She had not resisted. She had complied with every command he had given her. But she also understood in that moment that the facts of what she had actually done did not matter. What mattered was the narrative that Officer Whitfield was creating. The report he would write later. The version of this story that would be the official version. He guided her toward his patrol car, one hand on her arm, the handcuffs cutting into her wrists. The neighbors were still recording. She could see their faces, surprised, horrified, documenting this moment. Some of them she recognized. There was the woman from 2 houses down who had waved at her once in the grocery store. There was the older man who had nodded to her at the mailbox a few weeks ago. And there were also people from other houses, People who had come out to see the disturbance. People who were now seeing her as a criminal being arrested, rather than as the neighbor who had bought her house legitimately and lived in accordance with all the rules of the neighborhood. The back of the patrol car smelled like plastic and human suffering. Leila could see scratches on the interior where other people had struggled. Other people who had been placed in this back seat under circumstances that were, she assumed, usually more justified than hers. Officer Whitfield got in the front and started the engine. The car pulled away from the curb, away from her house, away from the Mercedes that sat abandoned on the street, away from the normal life she had been heading toward. At Metropolitan General Hospital in the administrative wing on the 4th floor, Chief of Hospital Administration Derek Hammond received a call from the police department. The call was short. The message was clear. One of his physicians, Dr. Leila Okonkwo, had been arrested at her home for obstruction of justice and resisting a police officer. Derek stood up from his desk so fast his chair rolled backward and crashed into the wall. He had worked with Leila for 7 years. He had observed her surgeries. He had seen her interact with families during the worst moments of their lives. He had never seen anything in her behavior that would suggest the kind of person who would obstruct justice or resist authority. And more than that, she had just saved a life. She had just completed an emergency craniotomy on an 8-year-old girl with severe traumatic brain injury. The surgery had been documented. The family had been there. There were medical records, surgical notes, evidence that placed her at the hospital for the entire period that would preclude her from being involved in whatever incident had led to her arrest. Derek picked up his phone and made a call to the police department directly. "I need to speak to your supervisor," he said. "There has been a serious mistake." Chief Caldwell Byron had been in his position for 9 months. He was new to the department, brought in from a larger city to implement reforms and modernize practices. He was also black, which meant he carried a particular burden in this moment. The knowledge that one of his officers had done something that was difficult to defend, and that the public would be watching to see how he responded. When Derek's call came through, Byron listened carefully to what was being said. The hospital administrator made a compelling case. The doctor in question had just saved a child's life. She had been at the hospital during the entire incident that led to her arrest. The charges seemed circumstantial at best. Byron made a decision in that moment that would ultimately lead to the uncovering of patterns that had been hidden within his department for years. He ordered an investigation into Officer James Whitfield's personnel file. What Detective Sarah Wright found when she opened that file was chilling. 11 previous complaints of racial profiling. 9 of those complaints involved women of color. All of the complaints had been dismissed without investigation, settled quietly, or determined to be without merit through a process that seemed remarkably lacking in rigor. "This is a pattern," Sarah told Chief Byron, laying the documents out on his desk. "This is not one bad stop. This is a systematic approach to targeting specific communities." Byron leaned back in his chair and felt something cold settle in his chest. This was exactly the kind of institutional problem that he had been brought in to solve, and it had been hiding right in front of everyone, protected by a culture that did not ask hard questions and a process that accepted easy answers. "I want everything," Byron said. "I want his phone records. I want his text messages. I want to understand the full scope of what this officer has been doing." The forensic extraction of Officer Whitfield's phone revealed something deeply disturbing. Text messages between Whitfield and other officers. Language that was explicitly racist. Discussions about targeting specific neighborhoods because the residents were less likely to lawyer up. References to easy pickings and to women who would not cause trouble. There was also evidence of financial motivation. Metro Towing Company, which had a contract with the city for vehicle towing, had apparently been providing payments to officers who generated stops that resulted in towing. Whitfield's name appeared in the financial records multiple times. He had been receiving kickbacks for traffic stops that were designed to generate towing opportunities, not to address actual traffic safety. Detective Wright compiled all of this evidence into a comprehensive report. The scope was larger than anyone had initially realized. This was not just about one officer abusing his authority. This was about a corruption scheme that involved multiple officers, a towing company, and a willingness on the part of the department to overlook patterns of behavior that should have been impossible to ignore. "We need to move carefully," Byron told Wright. "But we also need to move quickly. If this gets out before we are ready, there could be an attempt to suppress evidence or destroy documentation." "There is something else," Wright said. She pulled up hospital records on her computer. The girl that Dr. Okonkwo operated on, the one who had the brain surgery. Her name is Emma Whitfield, and her father is our Officer Whitfield. Byron felt something click into place. The irony was almost too perfect to believe, but it was real. The officer had arrested the woman who had saved his daughter's life, without knowing it was her, without understanding that the person he had tased was the surgeon whose actions had meant that his daughter would live. "Let us find out if he knows," Byron said. "Let us see if anyone has told him yet." Over the next week, Detective Wright compiled a comprehensive report of Officer Whitfield's misconduct. The evidence was overwhelming. There were 237 total stops that Whitfield had conducted over the course of 11 years. Of those stops, 186 had involved drivers of color. Black women specifically had been stopped 118 times, which was roughly 5 times the baseline expected for his precinct. Of those 118 stops, only 32 had resulted in actual traffic citations. The rest had been stops with no outcome, stops that served no legitimate law enforcement purpose, stops that were purely about exercising authority over people that Whitfield had decided in advance were suspicious. Financial records showed that Whitfield had received payments totaling $52,000 from Metro Towing over a 3-year period. The pattern was undeniable. He had been using his authority not to enforce traffic laws, but to generate income for himself by creating traffic stops that would lead to towing opportunities. And now he was facing charges that included not just assault with intent, but also corruption, abuse of authority, and violation of civil rights. The question that remained was how to present this evidence in a way that would lead to genuine accountability, in a way that would demonstrate that the institution could hold its own people responsible, in a way that would honor the trust that had been broken. The city council chambers were packed. The local news had picked up the story. A police officer arrested for assaulting a surgeon in her own neighborhood. Financial corruption uncovered. A pattern of racial targeting revealed. The room was filled with people from the community, with reporters, with city officials, with the families of women who had been stopped by Officer Whitfield under circumstances that now seemed clearly predatory. Chief Caldwell Byron stood at the podium with his dress uniform pristine, his bearing rigid, his expression controlled. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the weight of it. Standing in a public forum to acknowledge that his department had failed, that an officer under his watch had committed crimes, that a system designed to protect people had instead been used to exploit them. It was difficult, but it was also necessary. "I want to be clear about something," Byron began, his voice filling the chambers. "The allegations against Officer James Whitfield represent a failure of this department. Not just his individual failure, but a failure of the institutions and processes that allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for more than a decade. We are here today to acknowledge that failure and to commit to ensuring that it never happens again." He presented the evidence systematically, the pattern of stops, the financial corruption, the text messages revealing explicit prejudice, the impact on the community. When he was finished, Detective Wright took the podium and presented the data more formally. The statistics, the timeline, the scope of the misconduct. And then the victims were asked to speak. Margaret Chen came to the podium first. She was a professional woman in her early 40s, composed but with evident emotion beneath the surface. She described being stopped by Officer Whitfield 2 years earlier for a broken taillight that did not actually exist. She described the search of her vehicle, the way he had handled her belongings, the way he had looked at her with contempt. "I did not understand what was happening," Margaret said. "I thought there was something I had done wrong. I thought maybe there was something about the way I was driving that I did not understand. But looking at the evidence now, I understand that I was stopped because of the color of my skin, and that the officer who stopped me was paid by a towing company to generate stops that would result in towing. I was a business transaction to him. I was not a person." Then came LaToya Johnson, a mother who had been stopped and questioned about non-existent drug paraphernalia, who had missed her son's birthday because of the detention. Then came Kendra Anderson, a woman with a master's degree who had been asked to recite the alphabet backwards as a field sobriety test, even though she had not been suspected of driving under the influence. 7 women in total, 7 stories, 7 moments when Officer Whitfield's authority had been used against them, when the badge and uniform had been used not to protect, but to exploit. And then, at the end of all the other testimony, Dr. Leila Okonkwo was called to speak. Leila approached the podium with a sense of purpose that had been building since the moment she had been arrested. She had spent 3 days in custody before charges were dropped, before it became clear that the evidence did not support the narrative that Officer Whitfield had created. She had lost her freedom, even briefly, for the crime of asserting her own truth. "I am not here to tell you about the surgery I performed," she began, and her voice carried clearly through the chambers. "I am not here to ask for sympathy based on my profession or my accomplishments. I am here because I was stopped in my own neighborhood, in my own car, by an officer of the law who had already decided who I was before he ever approached my window. I am here because evidence was irrelevant to him, because my credentials did not matter, because his preconceived notions about what a black woman should be able to afford were more important to him than the truth." She described the stop with clinical detail, the disbelief, the refusal to examine her credentials, the escalation. "He tased me," she said, and for just a moment her composure cracked. "After 16 hours of surgery. After saving a child's life, I was tased because I insisted on telling the truth about myself. And the worst part is that I understand now that this was not unique. This was not a one-time occurrence. This was something that happened to 7 other women that we know of, and probably more that we do not." And then she delivered the revelation that would tie everything together. "I want to tell you something that I did not know until very recently," Leila said. "The child whose brain surgery I performed that morning, the reason I was wearing scrubs, the reason I was exhausted, the reason I was driving through that neighborhood at that hour, that child is Emma Whitfield. Emma is Officer Whitfield's daughter. I spent 16 hours saving his daughter's life, and then he arrested me, and he still does not know that it was me." The chambers fell silent. The connection was too stark, too perfectly ironic, to be anything other than the full expression of the injustice that had occurred. Officer James Whitfield sat at a table in that hearing, and he realized watching Leila's face as she spoke who she was. He understood finally what he had done. He had assaulted the woman who had saved his daughter's life. He had exercised the power of his authority against the very person who had made the thing he loved most, his daughter, alive. The expression on his face was devastating. It was realization. It was shame. It was the moment when the consequences of his actions became fully unavoidably clear. The vote that followed was not close. Officer Whitfield was terminated from the police department effective immediately. Criminal charges were filed. A full investigation into the towing company corruption was opened. And more than that, the city council voted to implement a comprehensive set of reforms. Body cameras that would be mandatory and footage released within 72 hours. A ban on traffic stop quotas. A civilian review board with subpoena power to investigate complaints of misconduct. Annual bias training required of all officers. The system was being held accountable. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. Officer Whitfield's wife, Linda, sat in the gallery throughout the hearing. She heard Leila's testimony. She heard the revelation about her daughter. She heard the detailed account of her husband's actions. After the hearing, she sought Leila out in the hallway. "I am so sorry," Linda said. Her voice was shaking. "I did not know." Emma kept asking questions about why she was in the hospital, why there was an operation. "I did not have language to explain what you did, and now I understand what James did to you." Leila looked at this woman, this person who was married to the man who had assaulted her, and saw not a villain, but a person caught in a situation that had trapped her as surely as it had trapped everyone else. "Your daughter is alive because of good medicine and good luck," Leila said quietly. "The fact that your husband does not understand that, or that he could not appreciate it, says something about him. It does not say anything about you. You are not responsible for his choices." "I have filed for divorce," Linda said. "I told him that I cannot stay married to someone who would do this to the person who saved our daughter's life. I cannot teach Emma that his behavior is acceptable." Leila nodded. She did not feel triumph about this. She felt something more complicated. Relief, perhaps. Validation. But also the awareness that none of this erased what had happened. That the trauma of being tased, of being arrested, of being disbelieved, would stay with her. The months that followed were defined by Leila's commitment to continuing her work as a surgeon while also becoming an advocate for change. She returned to Metropolitan General Hospital, to the operating room where she felt most at home, to the work of saving lives and training the next generation of surgeons. But she also worked with community organizations to document cases of police misconduct, to help victims of racial profiling navigate the legal system, to ensure that the patterns exposed in Officer Whitfield's case would not be allowed to flourish elsewhere. The other women who had been stopped by Whitfield formed a support group. They filed civil suits against the city and the police department. They became visible, documented, undeniable proof that the problem was not just one bad officer, but rather a system that had failed to protect them. Some of the settlements were significant. Some of the women used that money to pursue educations, to start businesses, to rebuild lives that had been disrupted by arbitrary and abusive police contact. Officer James Whitfield served his prison sentence in a minimum security facility. He attended counseling, where a psychologist helped him begin to understand the racism that had shaped his worldview and his choices. The counseling was mandatory, not redemptive. There was no magical transformation that made him a good person. But there was accountability. There was a consequence that matched the severity of his actions. And there was the ongoing reality that the woman he had harmed was continuing to save lives, continuing to build a legacy, continuing to live as a testimony to the fact that what he had done to her could not define her. Emma Whitfield recovered fully from her surgery. The scar on her scalp faded over time. By age 10, she had decided that she wanted to become a doctor, inspired by the surgeon who had saved her life. Her mother enrolled her in science programs. Her father, no longer a presence in her daily life, watched from prison as his daughter grew into someone who would make the world better. That was his consequence as well, not just the loss of his freedom, but the loss of his daughter's respect. The knowledge that his actions had cost him the one thing that mattered most. The city implemented its reforms. Body cameras became standard. Footage began circulating within 72 hours, creating accountability and transparency that had been absent before. The quota system that had incentivized predatory stops was dismantled. The Civilian Review Board received complaints, investigated them, and began building a record of accountability that made it harder for bad officers to hide. Dr. Leila Okonkwo stood at a podium at a national medical conference 2 years after her arrest and spoke about the intersection of racial profiling and trauma. She talked about what it felt like to be doubted by someone with the power to hurt you. She talked about the persistence required to keep standing up for your own truth when institutions are designed to make you question it. And she talked about the little girl whose brain she had held in her hands, about the irony of saving a life and then being attacked by that child's father, about the complicated reality that justice was messy and imperfect but still possible. The audience stood and applauded, not because her story was unique. There were thousands of stories like hers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, but because she had refused to disappear, because she had fought back, because she had transformed her own trauma into a tool for holding the system accountable. And somewhere in a prison cell, Officer James Whitfield watched the news report of her speech and understood finally the full scope of what he had lost. 3 years after the traffic stop, Leila sat in the waiting room of Metropolitan General Hospital with Emma Whitfield and Emma's mother, Linda. Emma, now 11 years old and fully recovered from her surgery, was there for a follow-up appointment to ensure that the neural pathways around her surgical site were developing normally. When the examination was finished, Emma asked Leila a question that had been forming in her mind since she was old enough to understand what had happened. "Dr. Leila," Emma said, "why did my dad hurt you when you saved my life?" It was a simple question, asked by a child who was trying to make sense of an adult world that did not always make sense. Leila looked at Linda, who gave her a small nod, indicating that this conversation was necessary and needed to happen. "Because," Leila said carefully, "your father had fears that had nothing to do with you. He was afraid of people who looked like me. He was afraid of things he did not understand, and those fears made him do something terrible. But that had nothing to do with the fact that I wanted to help you. That had nothing to do with you being sick and needing surgery. It was about his own broken parts." "Is he going to be okay?" Emma asked. "Is he going to come home?" "No, sweetheart," Leila said. "He made choices that had consequences. He is going to be in prison for a long time. But more importantly, he was given a chance to learn, a chance to understand the harm he caused. That is what jail is for. It is a chance to understand what you did wrong." "Will he understand?" Emma asked. Leila thought about that question. She thought about Officer Whitfield in his cell, confronting every day the reality of what he had done. She thought about the other women, the 7 women and however many others there had been, carrying the trauma of his predatory stops. "I do not know," Leila said honestly, "but I know that I am going to keep doing the work I do. I am going to keep saving lives. I am going to keep speaking up against the things that are wrong. And I am going to make sure that what happened to me does not happen to someone else if I can help it." Emma nodded, processing this in the way that children process complex truths. As they left the hospital, Emma took Leila's hand. "I am going to be a doctor like you," Emma said. "I am going to help people." And in that moment, Leila understood something that made all of the pain worth it. The trauma was real. The violation was real. The injustice was real. But so was the fact that a child had been saved, that a system had been held accountable, that change had been made possible. It was not a happy ending, because happy endings are for stories where everything is fixed, everything is healed, everything is resolved. But it was an earned ending. It was an ending where truth had been vindicated, where power had been held accountable, where a woman had refused to accept the role she had been assigned and had instead become an agent of her own justice. If this story meant something to you, if it resonated with something in your own experience, or in your understanding of how power works and how systems protect their own, then please subscribe our channel. We tell stories of people who were underestimated, who were dismissed, who were targeted by people wielding authority without conscience. We tell stories of people who chose to stand up instead of disappearing, because patterns do not change when people look away. Patterns only change when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Patterns only change when victims become witnesses, when witnesses become advocates, when advocates become agents of change within institutions that desperately need to be changed. Dr. Leila Okonkwo's story is one of thousands, but it is also one of the stories that matters, because in telling it, we are saying something true. That your skin color, your gender, your background does not define your right to dignity, to truth, to the space that you have earned through your own effort and excellence. That is what this story is about. Not just one surgeon and one corrupt officer. It is about all of us, about the world we are building together, about the accountability we demand from institutions and the courage we demand from ourselves. Thank you for listening.